Okay, I've got to reroute my device. There we go. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I hope I'm live streaming. I really admire the patience of the Reverend Kerry Pemberton Ford. I'm a bit of a dinosaur in all of this, but last week it seemed to work. And I think I see Kerry on there, and it looks as though there's two people. So I've got a big audience, which is great. But three now. Oh my goodness, I'm getting all excited. So that's wonderful. It looks as though I'm on, so that's great. Again, Reverend Kerry Pemberton Ford, thank you very much for the opportunity. Last week we had a little bit of a problem because I think my internet connection left or broke down, but I didn't realize because I was broadcasting to the back of my phone. Now I can see myself. And anyway, let's get back to last week. I suppose what I was trying to do was to look at how the impact and the influence that we can have on people can actually last for decades. I think in some ways, when we think of the love of a mother who got her love from her mother and going back to grandparents and ancestors, it's a sign in some ways of how, love continues to just to grow and manifest itself throughout the generations. And one of the people who had a huge impact on my life, as I mentioned last week, was Desmond Tutu. I invited him in 1984 to attend an international conference on world peace and poverty to celebrate the 800th anniversary of the birth of St. Francis of Assisi. And unfortunately he couldn't come because his passport had been confiscated. But he did come in 1984. And a story he told really changed the trajectory of my life in terms of looking at the lessons of the Great Irish Potato Famine, as known particularly in America, with what was happening in the world today in terms of hunger and injustice and so on. And that set me on a whole trajectory of learning about many, many aspects of the Great Hunger. And one of the stories I learned was of a little known incident that happened in Arkansas in 1847. It was the worst moment, the darkest year, in fact, in Irish history, when literally hundreds of thousands of people were dying of starvation and hunger-related diseases. And the Vice President of the United States put out an appeal across the United States to help relieve the suffering of Ireland and of Scotland, because the crofters in the Highlands were also suffering. And a group of Quakers, they began to go out trying to raise funds to send back to Ireland. And they met a group of Choctaw Indians who had been forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands in Mississippi in 1831-32. They were the first to be actually moved in what became known as the Trail of Tears. We know of the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the one that very often is highlighted, but in fact the Choctaw were the first of the so-called civilized tribes of the southeast of the United States to be moved to Oklahoma, the land of the red man. And they lost almost half their people in that move, particularly because they were moved in wintertime. It was horrendous. So this was just, little more than 16 years after that Holocaust that they had experienced. And they were told about the suffering of the Irish. And obviously we were told some stories of what was happening on this probably never before heard of island off the west coast of the European mainland. And clearly the Choctaw could hear echoes of their own suffering, and from their meagre resources they raised $170, which they gave to the Quakers, who in turn then sent it to Ireland. And it's reported in history as the poor Indian giving his mite to the poor Irish. And obviously a reference to the widow's mite in the gospel. And this all came from, a story told by Desmond Tutu. And then you fast forward to 2020. I went to the Choctaw, first of all, in 1989 to thank them. I was the first Irish person in history since 1847 to actually go and thank them. And then I brought them to Ireland. And that brought about a whole consciousness within the Irish, like a really deep sense of affection towards Native American people. And then fast forward to 2020, and here we are caught in this confinement of COVID times. And of course, we're now seeing like there's literally a shipwreck happening in the United States because of very poor federal leadership in relation to combating the pandemic. And one of the groups that are really, really being impacted are Native American people. And so a group of Navajo Hopi people in the state of Utah, they were facing horrendous situations, like where COVID-19 was rapidly going through the community. And of course, in order to try and get the people to stay at home, they put together a whole community action. And they raised funds to help people who were isolated. And they created a GoFundMe appeal, and they put it up on the internet. And someone from Ireland saw it, and they remembered the story of the Choctaw who had helped the Irish during the Great Famine, and they reposted it. And I think originally they had hoped maybe to raise $50,000 or $100,000. And they didn't have huge expectations, but the next thing they began to see, first of all, a trickle and then a stream and then a virtual river of donations coming through. And they became somewhat perplexed, and they began to look and realize that a lot of them were coming from Ireland and from the Irish American diaspora around the world. And I checked last night, and as of last night, they had actually received something like $3.8 million. $3.8 million in donations, most of them coming from the Irish. Now, I'm just telling that story because I think it's very hopeful, it's beautiful. It also tells the importance of saying thank you to people. But it comes from that little story that Desmond Tutu inspired. The story he told of his encounter with a little girl in one of the homelands, as he described, as dumping grounds for the displaced people, which sparked in my mind a memory of the Great Famine and set me on a whole course of investigation, which led to this. So the Choctaw led the famine walk that I created in 1990, and then in 1991, Desmond Tutu and his beautiful wife Leah, they came and led the same walk. And I always remember we had a wonderful dinner the night before. Like, there was great storytelling, jokes, laughter. I mean, the laughter of Desmond Tutu, even the memory of it just brings a smile to one's face. But the following morning, the day of the walk, we got up for breakfast, and we were waiting for the breakfast to be called into the dining hall, and there was a big blazing fire, I remember, and we all sat around the fire. Desmond was there, and Leah, we had given her a beautiful green orange sweater which she wore for the walk, and she was covering herself as well with a shawl. And during this gentle conversation, I asked Archbishop Tutu, who's your favorite saint? And he said, actually, there's three. And he said, St. Francis of Assisi, the Little Flower, and Mary Magdalene. And I was kind of surprised about the Little Flower, because Little Flower I would have always thought was very much a Catholic saint. And then I discovered that he actually had named his first daughter Tandika Teresa, after Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower. And also, interestingly, the former British Prime Minister, Theresa May, was named after the little flower. She was actually born on the feast day of the little flower, the 1st of October, and I know that Theresa May's father was an Anglican minister. So I was really intrigued how Saint Therese had influenced also like members of the Anglican community. And later we talked about Saint Therese, and I want to reflect in terms of our COVID times. I want to reflect on those three saints, because I think that they have very relevant and important things to say to us. But in terms of Saint Therese, she wrote an autobiography. She actually died at the age of 24, and when you read the autobiography, Story of a Soul, it's quite astounding, the depth of wisdom that this young woman had. And it had to come from another source. It really had to come from another source. But she's known as the little flower because she actually saw herself as a tiny little flower in the great garden of creation. And she saw the presence of God in everything. But she also had this call to be a missionary. And yet she actually chose confinement. So again, here we are, many of us asked to stay at home in order to flatten the curve and to try to halt the spread of the coronavirus. And here at the age of 15, Thérèse of Lisieux, in the year 1888, she entered the Carmel of Lisieux. And so she never went outside this, maybe an acre in space altogether in the town of Lisieux. They had a large garden in the back with trees and with obviously plants and flowers and so on. But this was her world. And yet she had this extraordinary sense of humanity within the Carmel for all of humankind. And so much so that after her death, she was actually named by the Roman Catholic Church as the patroness of the missions. The other thing is that she talked about and she wrote about her little way, the way of simplicity. And again, we look at the world, and even in terms of America, like people talking about, I saw a horrendous poster last week of people standing like with the American flag and a statement that said, I will defend my freedom over your safety. In other words, like, I have the right to go wherever I want, do whatever I want, even if it affects, your health. And I think that freedom also brings with it enormous responsibilities. And we're living in a world of 7.5 billion people. We live on a planet which is a beautiful planet, and I'm going to reflect on that at the end. But it's a beautiful planet in that it provides for our needs. But as Gandhi said, the earth is enough for everyone's need, not enough for everyone's greed. So there is a responsibility there that, we only use what we need. And we know that even by the end of this century, the population will have risen to about 11 billion people. So we can't continue, with this sense that the earth is an infinite source of feeding our materialism. We've got to become much more simple, both in terms of the consumerism we have around us in terms of goods, but also in terms of the type of foods that we eat. We need to be moving away more and more from meat to much more plant-based diets. And indeed, last year, the Lancet issued a joint statement in which they showed that the earth could actually feed 11 billion people if we went back to more of a plant-based diet. And of course, it would be good for the health of the earth. Whereas at the moment, we are actually consuming every year now the equivalent of 1.5 Earths. And the earth can't do that. And one wonders, like, even in terms of, we still don't know where the COVID-19 has come from, but there is a strong suspicion that the more we encroach into, the habitats of wildlife, and the more we come further and further, or closer and closer in contact, rather, with wildlife and destroy their habitats, that, we are actually exposing ourselves to all manner of viruses, which will become more frequent if we don't become, more gentle with nature, and more attuned to nature, and more respectful of nature, and more respectful of the habitats of wildlife. And it was interesting last week, the feed broke just as I had begun to read from the opening chapter of the book of Genesis. And I was just about reaching the point where, on the 6th day, God saw all that he had made, and it was good. But then it said, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number. This was after creating Adam and Eve. And he said, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was so. Now, I think we as human beings have misinterpreted, that particular reading of Genesis, because this idea that, we would subdue the earth, that we would rule over it, it was as if God was giving us carte blanche to do whatever we want. And of course, that is not the case. That is not the case. We have to now reimagine our relationship with all creation. We are here as guardians. We are here, and we share an earth that is teeming with all life. And indeed, very clearly, in this, it says, God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food, and to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. So in other words, God also is clearly saying that he has created the earth in such a way that all sentient beings, have the right to experience the generosity of his creation. So there we are. Thérèse of Lisieux, in her confinement, had this enormous sense of humanity, wanted to be a missionary, and even in her confinement, she is now known as the patron saint of missions. She also wanted to be a priest. She writes about this in her autobiography, and it's very beautiful what she writes about the priesthood. Although in the end, I don't agree with her conclusion, because she says that in the end, she chooses, not to be like St. Francis of Assisi. Francis never became a priest. But the difference between Thérèse and St. Francis of Assisi was Francis of Assisi had a choice. She didn't, because woman are gerrymandered out of, particularly in the Roman Catholic faith, are gerrymandered out of that great privilege. And it's wonderful to see Reverend Kerry and Reverend Empo and other women coming forward. And certainly the Anglican communion is leading the way in this. And that led me then one day thinking about why Desmond Tutu had talked about Mary Magdalene. So I sent him an email and I said, Archbishop, I remember that conversation we had before breakfast, and you mentioned Mary Magdalene, and I'm curious as to why Mary Magdalene. And I suppose I was still under the illusion at that stage that Mary Magdalene, was a reformed prostitute and so on. And all of that confusion of the different Marys in the Bibles that, men created, I think, in many ways to somehow diminish her and reduce her. And he came back and he talked about how Mary, was the one who proclaimed the living Christ, the resurrected Jesus. And he also referred to her as the apostle of the apostles. And that again led me on another very deep channel of reflection. And the realization, that certainly in the Roman Catholic communion, we are a broken body, functioning on one lung and half a brain, because we've actually excluded half the wisdom and intelligence available to us in terms of leadership, completely excluded, set aside as if they don't count. And I remember I lived in France for a period, and I used to go to a church named after St. Joan of Arc, and I noticed in this church that no woman was allowed onto the sanctuary. And I remember particularly on the Easter Vigil one night I attended, and I counted something like 49 males from the age of about 8 to about 80, all entering the sanctuary, and the women were left, in the pews. And then I attended the Pentecost ceremony 40 days later, at which there were a number of people being confirmed. And so the bishop was there. And again, I noticed in the cathedral in Versailles that no woman was allowed on the altar. So I decided I would confront the bishop. And I went up to him and I said, "Do you have a policy of not allowing women onto the sanctuary?" And I remember he says, "It's not that I have a policy, it's just that I do not want to give them expectations they cannot realize." So I said, "You're talking about the priesthood?" Yes. I says, "Well, why can't women be priests?" And I said, "Now, Bishop, I want to ask you a question." I remember when I, as a young Roman Catholic, was making my confirmation, we had to learn off by rote certain things related to the sacrament, and we were told that the bishop would come down and pick out some people and ask them, and if you didn't answer the question correctly, you wouldn't be allowed to complete your confirmation, and you might even get a wallop from the bishop. So I remember we would live in trepidation as the bishop come down. You were trying to make yourself disappear in the hope that he wouldn't see you. So anyway, this was kind of the reverse. And I said, "Now, Bishop, I want to ask you this question." I said, "What is the most important tenet of our faith?" And he went, I said, "Come on, Bishop, tell me, what is the most important tenet of our faith?" And he went, I said, "I'll tell you. It's that Jesus rose from the dead." And I said, 3 of the Gospels agree that he first appeared to the woman, and that he specifically tasked Mary Magdalene to actually proclaim to the apostles and therefore to the world the most important tenet of our faith: Jesus has risen from the dead. So I said, how therefore can we exclude women from the sanctuary? And also I remember I studied for the priesthood for a period, and I remember being brought into the chapel one day, and the priest made us all as young seminarians look around, and he asked, what's the most important symbol here? And we all pointed to the tabernacle because, Roman Catholics believe that the real presence of Jesus is contained in the Eucharist, and therefore in the tabernacle. And he said, no, it's the altar. And this again made me think, what does the altar represent? Is it the table of the Last Supper, or is it the altar of Calvary? And so when was the first Mass, in a sense? And I actually believe that the Last Supper was a symbolic ritual through which Jesus taught his followers, whom I believe were men and women, because who prepared this great feast of Passover? And I don't believe it was just confined to a bunch of buddies all sitting around a table. That was not the culture of the Jewish feast of Passover. It was a great family and community gathering. So women had to be there as well as other men who were not considered apostles. And I believe it was a symbolic ritual through which Jesus taught his followers how he wanted them to memorialize him after his death and resurrection. But at that stage, they didn't understand. Because number one, he had not gone through his passion and crucifixion and death, and he had not risen from the dead. So they didn't fully understand it. And in fact, the story of the road to Emmaus, where you have two followers of Jesus whom I believe were present, at the so-called Last Supper. And they are despondent when Jesus meets them and they don't recognize him. And he said, what's up? And they said, well, you must be the only person who hasn't heard about this man, Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. We thought he was going to be our Savior, our Messiah, and yet he was crucified. But now some of the women are now saying that he's risen from the dead. And so then Jesus walks with them and he explains how the scriptures had predicted this. And when they reached Emmaus, he was about to go on, and they said, no, wait, come with us, share a meal with us. And then at the breaking of the bread, it's almost as if that's what he meant. Because now they understood what had happened at the Last Supper. And here it was again. And at that point he disappeared. Because now they had it, they got it, right? And for me, the first Mass has to be on the altar of Calvary, the supreme sacrifice. And who were with Jesus on the altar of Calvary? The majority were the women, because the men had run off and abandoned him. So the idea that women are excluded from priesthood, I think, is an abomination. And I think it really has wounded us, in terms of our deepest humanity. And you read Thérèse of Lisieux and her calling to the priesthood, and it was an authentic calling. And I remember I challenged the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster over a year ago. He was at an event which I attended, and I talked about this gerrymandering. And I said, think about it. Only men can become priests, and those priests either have imposed upon them or elect a bishop, who have imposed upon them or elect a cardinal, who in turn elect the pope. And again, it's that idea of the broken body, the one lung and the half a brain. And I often think in terms of the terrible trauma that ordinary Catholics have had to go through in terms of confronting the cover-up by the hierarchy of the terrible abuse of our innocent young people, and the real betrayal of trust, sacred trust, by priests and bishops in terms of that abuse. And I was thinking, that if you had a child in a room, half of which is filled with women and half of which of men, the men would probably do exactly what the hierarchy did in the past. They'd be thinking of, in terms of this abused child, how do we protect ourselves in the institution? The woman would be thinking, how do we protect the child? And that's something that's missing. Anyway, I'm coming very close to the end now, and the other one was St. Francis of Assisi. In fact, it was St. Francis of Assisi which began my friendship with Desmond Tutu, and it was to the conference to celebrate the 800th anniversary of his birth that we invited Desmond Tutu to come in 1982, and he told me actually that he was himself a Franciscan tertiary, which again is really, really interesting. And in the lead up to the conference, I used to go into the church where we were holding it, and I would pray. And I wrote this reflection, and I'd like to share it with you as a way of finishing. I know that the Reverend Kerry wanted me to talk about Africa's Great Green Wall, and maybe I can come back and talk about that specifically on another occasion. But again, I'd like to dedicate this to Desmond Leah Tutu, because this was written very much in the spirit of St. Francis of Assisi, and thinking about, just the beauty of our earth, this miracle that God has created in the cosmos. We literally live in a cosmos, a known universe of something like 3.9 billion light years across, filled with billions and billions of galaxies, with trillions and trillions of stars and planets, and it's quite possible there's other life out there, but for now we are the only life form who have the great gift of consciousness, who exist in the universe and who have the opportunity to give it meaning. I like to just finish off by reading this, what I wrote in 1982, Jewel of the Universe. How I love you, Mother Earth, jewel of the universe. Perfectly positioned, you encourage life and sustain it. Upon you, humankind rushes to and fro, seldom stopping to acknowledge your beauty and dignity. We take the mystery of day and night and year to year for granted. We seldom marvel at the speed with which you spin and the vast solar orbit you travel, resulting in the rich splendour of your seasons. More and more as our knowledge expands, we learn that you alone are the only known life giver. Our nearest neighbours, Venus and Mars, are either too hot or too cold. Teach us, Mother, to love and respect you as an infant reveres its own. As a child is nurtured by its mother, so too all Earth's children are nurtured by you. You provide for our every need. Physically you build us, mentally you enrich us, emotionally you heal us, and spiritually you are part of our essence. As your children, teach us to share in the greatness of your generosity. It was never your intention to care for some while neglecting others. You provide enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. That is your most basic law of nature. As members of your family, teach us to love one another as you love us, by sharing your resources fairly and with justice. Your surface and your seas are the breadbasket of all humanity. Teach us, O Mother Earth, that hunger and oppression insult your selfless generosity. And teach us, O Mother, that no man or nation has the right to possess your destruction. In loving you, may present and future generations acknowledge we do not inherit you from our parents, we borrow you from our children. Thank you very much for the privilege of sharing this, and I wish you a beautiful day. And can I ask you My dear friend Waylon Gary Whitedeer, Choctaw artist, he contacted me yesterday from hospital. He's actually in intensive care where they suspect he may have had a mild heart attack, although from the symptoms he may have COVID, I don't know, but I would really appreciate if you would keep him in your prayers. Thank you very much, and God bless you, and have a lovely day.